The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Sarah Bennett adjusted her navy blue blazer as she walked through the heavy oak doors, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 15 years of legal practice and numerous published works on judicial reform. Today was different, though. She wasn't here as an attorney, but as a defendant for a simple traffic violation. Sarah had chosen to represent herself, considering it a minor issue that wouldn't require additional legal counsel. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent countless hours in courtrooms just like this one, but always on the other side of the aisle. The courtroom was already filling up with the usual morning crowd, nervous defendants, stern-faced attorneys, and court officers going about their routine. The air carried the familiar scent of wood polish and anxiety, a combination Sarah knew all too well. She took her seat in the third row, pulling out her documentation with organized precision. Judge Michael Harrison's reputation preceded him. At 65, he'd served on the bench for over 2 decades and was known throughout the county for his no-nonsense approach and strict adherence to protocol. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an appearance of authority that matched his position perfectly. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom as Judge Harrison entered. His black robe swayed slightly as he walked to his chair, his expression neutral but commanding. Sarah stood with the rest of the courtroom, observing the man who would be presiding over her case. What neither of them knew at that moment was how their paths had already crossed in a completely different context. The universe had a strange way of bringing people together, and today it had chosen to do so in the most unexpected manner. The proceedings began with the usual efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Case after case was called, with Judge Harrison maintaining his trademark brisk pace. His voice carried clearly through the courtroom as he addressed each defendant, his decision swift and unwavering. Case number 47,823, Sarah Bennett, the court clerk announced. Sarah rose smoothly from her seat, approaching the podium with the same composure she'd shown countless times while representing her own clients. She stood straight, hands clasped in front of her, watching as Judge Harrison glanced down at her case file. The charge was simple: allegedly running a red light at the intersection of Maple and 4th Street. The officer's report stated she had crossed the line after the light had turned red, though Sarah was certain it had been yellow when she entered the intersection. Judge Harrison looked up from his papers, his steel-gray eyes meeting Sarah's brown ones. There was no recognition in his gaze, no indication that he had any idea who she really was. To him, she was just another case number, another defendant in his busy morning docket. "Miss Bennett," he began, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that judges often cultivated over years on the bench. "You're charged with violating Traffic Code 31-2A. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied clearly, her voice steady and professional. The morning light had shifted now, creating a glare on Judge Harrison's glasses as he peered down at her over their rims. The courtroom remained quiet, the only sound being the soft scratching of the court reporters typing and the distant hum of the building's air conditioning. What made this moment particularly remarkable wasn't just the fact that Sarah Bennett was a respected attorney standing as a defendant, or that Judge Harrison was known for his stern demeanor. What made it extraordinary was the leather-bound book sitting in both their offices at that very moment, a book they had spent the last year collaborating on, a book about judicial reform and racial bias in the American legal system. Yet here they were, author and co-author, judge and defendant, neither aware of their connection. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, oblivious to the irony it illuminated. Court officers stood at their posts, the clerk continued logging cases, and the giant clock on the wall ticked forward, counting down to the moment when the seemingly routine traffic case would transform into something far more significant. Sarah stood ready to present her case, unaware that this ordinary Tuesday morning would soon become a turning point in both their lives, a moment that would force them to confront their own biases and assumptions in ways they never expected. Sarah Bennett stood confidently at the podium, her evidence folder open before her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Judge Harrison shuffled through her case file, his expression growing increasingly stern with each page he reviewed. "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison's voice carried a sharp edge, "please explain why you believe you're not guilty of running this red light." Sarah cleared her throat and began her defense. Your Honor, I entered the intersection while the light was yellow. I have dash cam footage from my vehicle that shows. Miss Bennett, Judge Harrison interrupted, his tone noticeably harsher than it had been with previous cases. Are you suggesting that the officer's report is incorrect? The courtroom fell silent. Several attorneys waiting for their cases watched with growing interest. Even the court clerk paused her typing, sensing the unusual tension in the air. No, Your Honor, Sarah replied evenly, maintaining her composure. I'm simply presenting evidence to support my position, as you can see from the footage. I don't need to see any footage, Ms. Bennett. Judge Harrison cut her off again. His fingers drummed against his desk, a habit he displayed when his patience wore thin. The officer's report clearly states you were a full car length behind the intersection when the light turned red. Sarah noticed the whispers among the courtroom staff. Barbara, the court reporter who had served for 15 years, exchanged glances with Officer Rodriguez, the bailiff. They had seen thousands of cases in this courtroom, but something about Judge Harrison's demeanor today seemed different. Your Honor, if I may, Sarah persisted, her legal training kicking in. State law clearly provides that if any portion of the vehicle has entered the intersection during a yellow light. Miss Bennett, Judge Harrison's voice rose slightly. Are you attempting to lecture this court on traffic law? The tension in the room grew thicker. A young law clerk in the back row began taking notes, his pen moving rapidly across his legal pad. Something about this interaction felt significant, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands resting steady on the podium. No, Your Honor. I'm simply trying to present all relevant facts for the court's consideration. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the morning light. The facts, Ms. Bennett, are quite clear. You ran a red light, endangering yourself and others. Your attempt to justify this behavior with technical arguments only demonstrates a lack of respect for traffic safety and this court's time. The comment about respect caused several eyebrows to raise among the veteran courthouse staff. They had seen Judge Harrison handle countless traffic cases, many with defendants far less professional than Sarah, yet his current tone seemed unusually harsh. Furthermore, he continued, his voice growing colder, your insistence on challenging the officer's professional judgment suggests a problematic attitude toward law enforcement. Sarah's expression remained neutral, though her fingers tightened slightly on the podium's edges. As an attorney, she had faced judicial scrutiny before, but this felt personal, almost targeted. The young law clerk in the back continued writing, now drawing arrows and making connections on his notepad. Something about Ms. Bennett seemed familiar to him, though he couldn't quite place where he'd seen her before. Given your apparent disregard for traffic safety and authority, Judge Harrison announced, I'm setting the fine at $500, double the standard amount. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. Perhaps this will serve as a reminder to show proper respect for traffic signals and law enforcement. The courtroom collectively held its breath. Double fines were rare for first-time traffic violations, especially when the defendant had maintained professional decorum throughout the proceedings. Thank you, Your Honor. Sarah responded quietly, her dignity intact despite the harsh treatment. She gathered her documents with steady hands, though her heart raced with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. As she turned to leave the podium, Officer Rodriguez caught her eye, giving her a subtle look of sympathy. In his 12 years as bailiff, he had developed a keen sense for judicial temperament, and something about today's interaction felt off balance. Sarah walked back through the gallery, her heels echoing in the now silent courtroom. As she reached the oak doors, Judge Harrison was already calling the next case, his voice back to its usual professional tone. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his chambers later that evening, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he reviewed the final proofs for his upcoming book. The wall clock showed 7:30 p.m., well past the usual time he headed home, but the publisher's deadline loomed close. The manuscript, Modern Justice, Bridging Divides, lay open on his mahogany desk. His coffee had grown cold, forgotten during his intense focus on the final edits. As he flipped through the pages, his eyes landed only about the author's section at the back of the book. That's strange, he muttered, leaning closer to study the professional photograph of his co-author. The woman in the image wore a navy blue blazer, her warm brown eyes conveying intelligence and determination. Judge Harrison felt his stomach drop as recognition slowly dawned on him. Sarah Bennett's biography read. A distinguished civil rights attorney with 15 years of experience, Sarah Bennett has dedicated her career to promoting equality in the justice system. She holds degrees from Harvard Law School and has published numerous articles on judicial reform. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly as he remembered the morning's traffic court session. The same navy blazer, the same dignified presence, the same Sarah Bennett whom he had treated with such unwarranted severity. "Oh, good God," he whispered, pushing back from his desk. The leather chair creaked as he stood up abruptly, pacing across his chamber's worn carpet. His mind raced back through the morning's interaction, replaying every harsh word, every interruption, every dismissive gesture. Linda, his longtime judicial assistant, knocked softly before entering with another stack of files. She paused in the doorway, noticing his unusual agitation. "Is everything all right, Judge Harrison?" He turned to her, his face pale. "Linda, do you remember the woman from traffic court this morning? The one I fined double for the red light violation?" Linda nodded slowly. Yes, she was very professional despite. She trailed off, not wanting to criticize his handling of the case. "Pull her file for me, please, right now." While Linda hurried to retrieve the file, Judge Harrison slumped back into his chair. He picked up his phone, finger hovering over his email app where dozens of unread messages from Sarah sat, all discussing their book's final revisions. They had been collaborating for months, sharing insights about bias in the legal system, yet he hadn't recognized her in his own courtroom. Linda returned with the file, placing it gently on his desk. "Here you are, sir." And, "Judge Harrison?" The clerks were talking about that case afterward. They thought it seemed unlike you to be so harsh, biased, unprofessional. He finished her sentence, his voice heavy with realization. "Well, yes," Linda admitted quietly. Judge Harrison opened Sarah's traffic court file with slightly shaking hands. There it was, her full legal name, profession, and credentials, which he had barely glanced at during the morning session. The cruel irony of the situation hit him full force. He had just demonstrated exactly the kind of unconscious bias they had spent months writing about. His eyes drifted to their manuscript again. Chapter 3, Recognizing Our Own Biases, seemed to mock him from the page. He and Sarah had written that chapter together, discussing how even well-meaning judges could unknowingly perpetuate systemic inequities. The office fell silent except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. Linda stood awkwardly by the door, watching the usually composed judge struggle with his revelation. "Linda," he finally spoke, his voice quiet, "cancel my morning appointments tomorrow. I need to." He trailed off, unsure how to even begin addressing this situation. "Already done, sir," Linda replied softly. "And the publisher's office called earlier about the book launch next week. They need both authors to approve the final proof by Friday." The book launch. Judge Harrison felt a new wave of anxiety wash over him. In less than a week, he and Sarah were supposed to stand together before their peers, presenting their work on judicial fairness and reform. Now he had become a living example of everything their book argued against. As Linda quietly left the chamber, Judge Harrison remained at his desk, staring at Sarah's professional photograph. The wall clock continued its relentless ticking, marking each moment of his growing realization of what he had done. The evening shadows lengthened across his office floor, but he barely noticed, lost in thoughts of unconscious bias, privilege, and the long road to genuine self-awareness. Tomorrow, he would have to face both his actions and his co-author, but for now, he sat alone in his chambers, confronting uncomfortable truths about himself and the system he had served for over 2 decades. Judge Michael Harrison couldn't sleep. The digital clock on his bedside table glowed 2:47 a.m., its red numbers a harsh reminder of the red light violation that had started this whole mess. He sat in his home office, still wearing his pajamas and robe, reviewing video footage from his courtroom's security cameras. The house was silent except for the soft whir of his laptop and the occasional creak of his old leather chair. His wife, Susan, had given up trying to convince him to come to bed hours ago. "Michael," she'd said, "whatever it is, it can wait until morning." But it couldn't wait, not for him. On the screen, he watched himself presiding over that morning's traffic court session. The footage was crystal clear, almost painfully so. He had already replayed his interaction with Sarah Bennett 7 times, each viewing making him more uncomfortable than the last. Case number 47,823 is recorded voice announced from the laptop speakers. He paused the video, rubbing his tired eyes. Beside his laptop lay a legal pad filled with notes. He had been analyzing his own behavior, marking down every instance of bias he could spot. The list was disturbingly long. Reaching for his court records, he began pulling files from the past month's traffic violations. One by one, he compared the fines he had issued, the tone he had used, the patience he had shown. A pattern emerged that made his stomach churn. Defendants of color, particularly women, consistently received harsher treatment. "How did I not see this?" he whispered to the empty room. His phone buzzed, a text from his daughter Emma, a law student in her final year. "Dad, you okay? Mom said you're still up working." He typed back, "Just reviewing some cases. Go to sleep, sweetheart." Emma replied immediately, "Is this about that traffic court case everyone's talking about?" His heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, everyone's talking about?" "The courthouse grapevine, Dad. Word gets around. Some of my friends interning at the courthouse mentioned it, said it was unlike you. Unlike him, or exactly like him, just more obvious this time." The question haunted him as he turned back to his research. Judge Harrison opened his browser and typed "Sarah Bennett Attorney" into the search bar. Articles appeared, showcasing her impressive career: landmark civil rights cases, academic papers on judicial reform, interviews about systemic bias in the legal system. And there, in a recent legal journal, was their joint interview about the upcoming book. He clicked on the interview video. There he was, sitting beside Sarah just 3 weeks ago, confidently discussing the importance of recognizing unconscious bias in the justice system. "We must always be vigilant," his recorded self declared, "about examining our own preconceptions and assumptions." The irony made him wince. Standing up, Judge Harrison walked to his office window. The street below was empty, the neighborhood quiet under a blanket of darkness. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, an older white man in a bathrobe, looking suddenly very tired and very human. He thought about his own journey to the bench. 20 years of privilege, of being the default authority figure, of having his words and decisions rarely questioned. How had that shaped him? How had it blinded him? Returning to his desk, he pulled up his calendar for the past year. He began marking every case where he'd issued fines above the recommended amount. Then he cross-referenced those cases with defendant demographics. The pattern became clearer with each entry. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Emma. "Dad, remember what you told me when I started law school? Justice isn't just about following the law, it's about recognizing our own humanity. Maybe it's time to take your own advice." Out of all the messages he received tonight, this one hit hardest. His daughter, the next generation of legal professionals, reminding him of his own words. Judge Harrison opened a new document on his laptop and began typing, "Report on bias analysis in traffic court proceedings." It would take weeks to compile all the data, but it was a start. Below that, he started another document, "Proposed changes to judicial training and oversight." The sky outside his window began to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the darkness. He had been awake for nearly 24 hours, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. There was work to be done, starting with himself. On his desk, his phone lit up with a calendar reminder. Book launch meeting with Sarah Bennett, 48 hours. The clock was ticking, and he had some difficult conversations ahead. It started with a single tweet from Jason Chen, the young law clerk who had been taking notes during Sarah Bennett's traffic court appearance. Irony alert. Judge finds black female attorney without realizing she's his co-author on a book about judicial bias. Can't make this stuff up. Hashtag justice a fail. Within hours, the tweet had gone viral. Local news stations began calling the courthouse, requesting comments. Judge Harrison's office phone wouldn't stop ringing, and Linda, his assistant, had already turned away 3 television crews from the building's lobby. Sarah's phone was equally busy. Her law firm's receptionist had a growing list of journalists seeking interviews. Messages flooded her email, ranging from supportive colleagues to angry activists demanding she speak out about what happened. "Miss Bennett," her secretary called through the intercom, CNN is online too, and the Washington Post just emailed for the third time. Sarah sat at her desk, watching her computer screen fill with notifications. Someone had dug up a video clip from last month's legal conference where she and Judge Harrison had presented a preview of their book. The clip showed them sitting side by side, discussing the importance of recognizing unconscious bias in the courtroom. The ultimate test of our system, Judge Harrison said in the video, is how we treat those who appear before us, regardless of their background. The video had already been viewed 100,000 times. Local civil rights organizations began organizing protests outside the courthouse. Signs reading "Justice is colorblind, but some judges aren't," and "Practice what you preach" appeared in the hands of peaceful demonstrators. Inside her office, Sarah's colleague Marcus knocked on her door. "Have you seen this?" He held up his phone, showing a trending hashtag. #Judge yourself. "It's getting out of hand," Sarah replied, rubbing her temples. She hadn't wanted this kind of attention. The irony of the situation was powerful, yes, but she had hoped to address it privately with Judge Harrison. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Judge Harrison's fellow judges were struggling to handle the fallout. Judge Patricia Rodriguez, his longtime friend and colleague, stopped by his chambers. "Mike," she said gently, "the Chief Justice called. He's concerned about how this looks for the entire judicial system." The local newspaper, the Daily Chronicle, ran a front-page story. Judge's traffic stop drama highlights systemic bias. The article included quotes from legal experts analyzing the incident, alongside statistics about racial disparities in traffic court outcomes. Social media exploded with people sharing their own stories of courtroom bias. A Twitter thread by a legal advocacy group went viral, comparing fine amounts issued to different demographic groups in traffic courts across the state. Barbara, the court reporter who had witnessed the original interaction, found herself being interviewed by a local news station. "In all my years here," she said carefully, "I've never seen anything quite like it. The judge is usually very fair, which made this situation even more noticeable." The publishing house handling Judge Harrison and Sarah's book called an emergency meeting. Their publicity team was torn between seeing this as a PR nightmare and a powerful teaching moment. This could actually reinforce the book's message, one marketing executive suggested during a Zoom call. By late afternoon, #judging the judge was trending nationally. Legal blogs began publishing analysis pieces with titles like "When Bias Hits Home," "A Judge Faces His Own Medicine," and "The Traffic Stop That Exposed America's Judicial Blind Spot." Sarah's previous interviews about the book started resurfacing online. In one particularly poignant clip from 6 months ago, she discussed the subtle ways bias manifests in courtrooms. Sometimes, the person displaying bias doesn't even realize they're doing it. That's what makes it so dangerous. The courthouse security team had to establish a new procedure for handling the influx of media personnel. Officer Rodriguez, the bailiff, found himself turning away reporters every few minutes. "No comment" became his mantra for the day. As evening approached, both Sarah and Judge Harrison received calls from major news networks requesting their appearance on morning shows. The shared publisher sent urgent emails about handling the situation in a way that would maintain the integrity of their book's message. The day ended with a statement from the State Bar Association announcing a review of traffic court proceedings and fine distributions across all districts. What had started as a simple traffic violation had sparked a national conversation about judicial bias, privilege, and the long road to true justice reform. In their separate offices, both Sarah and Judge Harrison watched the story unfold, knowing that tomorrow would bring even more attention, more questions, and more pressure to address the elephant in the courtroom that had suddenly become visible to everyone. The conference room on the 15th floor of the publisher's office felt smaller than usual. Sarah Bennett arrived first, precisely at 2 p.m., her leather portfolio tucked under her arm. The city skyline stretched out behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, but she barely noticed the view. 5 minutes later, Judge Michael Harrison entered. He paused at the doorway, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. The room crackled with unspoken tension. This was their first face-to-face meeting since the traffic court incident 3 days ago. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the authority it had possessed in the courtroom. "Judge Harrison," she responded, her tone professional but distant. She remained seated, watching as he chose a chair across the large oak table. Their publisher's representative, Mary Chen, had wisely decided to be running late, giving them time to talk privately. The manuscript of their book lay between them on the table, its title Modern Justice, Bridging Divides, seeming more ironic than ever. "I've been reviewing my court records," Judge Harrison began, pulling out a thick folder. Not just from that day, but from the past several months. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Sarah watched him silently, her expression carefully neutral, the same expression she had maintained in his courtroom. "The patterns I found," he continued, then stopped, struggling to find the right words. "I've been part of the problem we wrote about, the very problem I claimed to be fighting against." Outside the conference room, city life continued as usual. Traffic humped 15 stories below, and clouds drifted past the windows. But inside, time seemed to stand still. "Do you know what struck me most about that day?" Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "It wasn't the fine. It wasn't even your tone. It was the fact that we had spent months writing about judicial bias together, and you still couldn't see me as anything but a black woman challenging authority." Judge Harrison flinched at her words. The truth in them hurt more than any angry outburst could have. "I've been on the bench for 20 years, he said quietly. "I thought I was one of the good ones. I thought I was different." He laughed bitterly. "I literally wrote a book about bias and still—" "That's exactly the point, isn't it?" Sarah leaned forward. "Bias doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a sign. It hides in the small moments, in the quick judgments, in the supposedly routine decisions." A coffee cart rolled past in the hallway, its wheels squeaking slightly. The mundane sound seemed out of place in the gravity of the moment. "The book launches next week," Sarah continued. "Everyone's waiting to see how we handle this. The media, the legal community, our readers." She paused. "What do you think we should do?" Judge Harrison met her eyes for the first time since entering the room. "I think we need to rewrite the introduction. Add this incident. Use it as a case study." He took a deep breath. "If we're truly committed to addressing bias in the justice system, we need to start with acknowledging our own failures." Sarah studied him for a long moment. The man sitting before her seemed different from the stern judge who had fined her just days ago. He looked older, more vulnerable, more human. "You understand this isn't just about one traffic court incident?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "It's about power, privilege, and the thousands of small decisions that shape our justice system. Decisions I've been making for 20 years without truly examining them." Sarah reached for the manuscript between them. "Then perhaps we should start rewriting." She opened her laptop. "But first, I think you owe me a refund on that traffic fine." For the first time that afternoon, the tension in the room eased slightly. Judge Harrison managed a small smile. "The fine has been vacated. And I've initiated a review of all my traffic court rulings from the past year." Just then, Mary Chen knocked on the conference room door, right on cue. She entered to find her two authors sitting closer together, the manuscript open between them, both focused on the work ahead. The confrontation hadn't solved everything. There were still hard conversations to be had, systems to be examined, and changes to be made. But it was a start. A real one this time, built on honest acknowledgement rather than theoretical discussions. Outside, the sun began its descent behind the city buildings, casting long shadows across the conference room floor. Sarah and Judge Harrison continued working, rewriting not just their book, but their understanding of justice itself. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel buzzed with anticipation. Journalists, legal professionals, and civil rights activists filled every seat. Judge Michael Harrison stood backstage, adjusting his tie for the 5th time in as many minutes. 2 minutes until we're live, a young producer informed him, rushing past with a clipboard. The book launch had transformed into something much bigger, a national conversation about judicial bias, being broadcast live on 3 major news networks. Sarah Bennett stood nearby, reviewing her notes one last time. Her red blazer stood out against the dark curtain, chosen deliberately for its power and presence. Unlike Judge Harrison, she appeared calm, though her fingers tightly gripped her note cards. "Ready?" she asked him, not looking up from her notes. "No," he answered honestly, "but that's probably the point." The event moderator, renowned civil rights attorney James Wilson, stepped onto the stage. "Good evening," his voice boomed through the speakers. We're here tonight for what was originally planned as a simple book launch. Instead, we find ourselves at the center of a national discussion about justice, bias, and accountability. Camera flashes peppered the audience. In the front row, Judge Harrison's daughter Emma sat beside her mother, both looking tense but supportive. Sarah's law partners occupied the adjacent seats, their expressions carefully neutral. "Please welcome our speakers," Wilson announced, Judge Michael Harrison and attorney Sarah Bennett. The applause was polite but reserved as they walked onto the stage. Judge Harrison reached the podium first, gripping its edges as he faced the crowd. The teleprompter before him displayed his prepared speech, but he ignored it. "I had a whole speech written," he began, his voice slightly shaky, "about how our book examines bias in the justice system. But standing here now, I realize I need to talk about something else first." He paused, looking directly at the audience. "I need to talk about failure, my failure." The room fell silent. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, recording devices held high. 3 weeks ago, I fined a black woman in my traffic court without recognizing she was my own co-author on a book about judicial bias. His words hung in the air. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so deeply troubling. Sarah watched from her seat, noting how the judge's shoulders seemed to carry a new weight. In the audience, his wife dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I've spent the past week reviewing hundreds of my past rulings," he continued. "The pattern of bias I found was undeniable. Different fines for different faces, harsher treatment based on race and gender, all while I believed myself to be fair and impartial." Cameras clicked rapidly. Social media exploded with real-time reactions to his confession. "But this isn't just about me," Judge Harrison said, turning to gesture toward Sarah. "This is about a system that allows such bias to persist, a system I've been part of for 20 years. Sarah stood and joined him at the podium. The contrast between them, the older white judge and the younger black attorney, wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "What happened in that traffic court," Sarah spoke into her microphone, "wasn't unique. It wasn't extraordinary, and that's exactly why it matters." She turned to face Judge Harrison. "What is extraordinary is having a judge acknowledge it, examine it, and commit to changing it." Together, they announced a series of initiatives: mandatory bias training for all court officials, regular audits of judicial decisions, a new oversight committee composed of diverse community members. The judge also revealed his decision to step down from traffic court duties until completing an extensive bias training program. "This isn't the end of our story," Sarah concluded. "It's barely the beginning. But it's a beginning based on truth rather than theory, on acknowledgement rather than avoidance." The question and answer session that followed was intense. Journalists pressed for details about the traffic court incident. Activists demanded specifics about the proposed reforms. Legal scholars debated the broader implications for judicial oversight. Through it all, Judge Harrison and Sarah stood together, answering each question with honesty and directness. They didn't pretend to have all the answers. They demonstrated a commitment to finding them. As the evening drew to a close, Emma Harrison approached the stage to hug her father. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she whispered, loud enough for only him to hear. "This is what real justice looks like." The event ended, but its impact was just beginning. News headlines the next day would call it a watershed moment in judicial accountability. But for Judge Harrison and Sarah, it was simply the first step in a longer journey toward true justice reform. 1 year had passed since the traffic court incident that changed everything. The courthouse looked the same from the outside, but inside, the changes were impossible to miss. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his renovated chambers, now adorned with artwork from local artists of various backgrounds. On his desk sat the latest edition of their book, Modern Justice: Bridging Divides, now a required text in several law schools. The chapter about his traffic court incident with Sarah had become one of the most cited cases in judicial bias training nationwide. Sarah Bennett walked down the familiar courthouse corridor, her heels clicking against the marble floor. This time, she wasn't here as a defendant or even as an attorney. She was here to lead the monthly bias training session for new judges, a program she and Judge Harrison had developed together. "Good morning, Ms. Bennett," called out Officer Rodriguez, the bailiff who had witnessed the original incident. He now served on the courthouse's newly established Equity Advisory Board. The new judges are eager to meet you. The training room was full when Sarah entered. 20 fresh-faced judges, recently appointed to the bench, sat ready with notebooks open. Judge Harrison joined her at the front of the room, their past confrontation now transformed into a powerful partnership. "Welcome," Sarah began, "to what might be the most important training of your careers. We're not here to talk about law, you already know that. We're here to talk about humanity." In the years since their public reckoning, the changes had rippled far beyond their local courthouse. State after state had adopted their training program. Traffic court statistics showed measurable improvements in fine equity across racial and gender lines. But more importantly, judges were learning to recognize and challenge their own biases. Last month, Judge Harrison shared with the group, "I caught myself making assumptions about a defendant based on their appearance. The difference is, now I recognize it. Now I stop. Now I question myself." The new judges listened intently. Among them sat Judge Harrison's daughter Emma, recently appointed to the family court bench. She had chosen to start her judicial career by going through her father's training program, wanting to learn from both his mistakes and his redemption. Outside the training room, the courthouse hummed with activity. The newly established Community Oversight Committee held its weekly meeting in the conference room. Representatives from various communities reviewed judicial decisions, looking for patterns and providing feedback. Linda, Judge Harrison's assistant, now spent part of her time managing the courthouse's bias response hotline, where people could report concerns about judicial conduct. The system wasn't perfect, but it was more transparent than ever before. "The transformation isn't just about numbers," Sarah explained to the new judges, pulling up a series of graphs on the screen. "It's about changing the culture of justice itself." The data showed significant changes. More consistent fines across demographic groups, improved public trust in the judicial system, and higher satisfaction rates among court users. But the most meaningful changes weren't visible in any chart. During the lunch break, Judge Harrison and Sarah sat in the courthouse cafe, something that would have seemed impossible a year ago. They watched as a diverse group of judges, attorneys, and court staff mingled naturally, discussing cases and sharing perspectives. "Remember when you said this wasn't just about one traffic court incident?" Judge Harrison asked, stirring his coffee. Sarah nodded, smiling slightly. "Look at us now." The afternoon session brought more changes. The courthouse unveiled its new digital tracking system, designed to flag potential bias patterns in judicial decisions before they became problematic. Every judge's rulings were now regularly reviewed for consistency and fairness. As the day drew to a close, Sarah stood at the courthouse steps, watching the sunset. A young black girl walked past with her mother, pointing at the building. "Mom, that's where Judge Emma works. She came to our school last week." The sight made Sarah smile. This was the real transformation, not just in policies or procedures, but in how the next generation viewed justice. Back in his chambers, Judge Harrison prepared to retire for the day. He looked at the framed traffic ticket on his wall, the one that had started it all, now serving as a daily reminder of how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. "Ready for tomorrow's session?" Sarah asked, stopping by his door. "Always," he replied, gathering his things. "There's still work to be done." Together, they walked out of the courthouse, their shadows long in the evening light. The building behind them stood as it always had, but its purpose had been transformed, from a simple house of law into a true home of justice. The traffic court incident that had once threatened to divide them had instead become the foundation for real change. It wasn't the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing journey toward true judicial equity.